So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Take Action for Women, Conflict, Peace and Security, where our Director of Advocacy, Lee Elwood Brown, will be having a conversation with Stephenie Foster, a renowned author. Before I introduce Stephenie, may I just take you to our Articles of Association under which Soroptimist International Limited operate, and where it states in the preamble our reason for being. Soroptimist International is a not-for-profit organisation, first constituted as a non-incorporated association in 1928 to unite the federations of Soroptimist International service clubs for women across the world and to promote, empower, enable and encourage the furtherance of the objects of Soroptimist International in all parts of the world. We began with the founding of our first Soroptimist Club in Oakland, California in 1921. It is a global voice for the improvement of the lives and status of women and girls through awareness, advocacy, and action. Soroptimist International is and always shall be strictly neutral upon matters of political controversy between nations, upon party politics, and upon matters of religion. So as you can see, our focus on issues for women and girls is about awareness, advocacy, and action. Advocacy is a word that slips off the tongue when we are asked what we do. So what is advocacy? It can be defined as any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, support or defends or pleads on behalf of others. But how is advocacy different from lobbying? Lobbying is only one kind of advocacy. Not all advocacy is lobbying, but all lobbying is advocacy. And there are many activities that comprise advocacy work, organizing and bringing together like-minded people to work on specific issues, educating legislators, government officials by providing information on issues through meetings, seminars, or indeed fact sheets, educating the public about the legislative process. This empowers the local communities to take action on their own future. Research, production of relevant resources that reflect the real story about the issues, perhaps organizing a rally, raising awareness of the needs, educational seminars, conferences, gathering together and sharing information, networking and planning for the future. Could be training, taking strategies and skills for actions on the issues, lobbying your local council, government officials on the issues that are pertinent and relevant to our issues. I have to thank a Soroptimist in the Federation of Soroptimist International in the Americas, who contacted SI and introduced Stephenie and her well-sourced and important toolkit, Take Action, Fighting for Women and Girls. This toolkit covers the basis of activism and advocacy. As all Soroptimists are aware, our service and work centers around two important sustainable development goals that affect all of the other SDGs. SDG 4 education and SDG 5 gender equality. This toolkit, which I encourage you all to purchase and read, I got my copy from Amazon, gives us specific information about 4 issues related to girls, women, and gender equality. The power and importance of education, expanding economic opportunities, eliminating gender-based violence, and participation in politics and public life. I encourage you to read this book. Stephenie is a recognized voice in women's leadership and empowerment. She is a founding partner of Smash Strategies, a consultant firm that helps institutions achieve better results by focusing on women's leadership and gender equality. She has a deep and broad expertise in women's economic and political empowerment, with decades of experience on Capitol Hill in the executive branch, the non-profit sector, and the law. She's been fighting for women and girls her entire career, empowering women in Afghan war zones, monitoring elections in Ukraine, representing the US State Department in meetings with government and civil society leaders, serving as a chief of staff in the US Senate. She has traveled, lived, or worked in over 100 countries across the world. She has consistently used her voice and actions to change discriminatory laws and policies and help shift cultural norms and inequalities. Stephenie has published major articles on women's global engagement in politics, the economy, and society. She began her career as an attorney. Stephenie, thank you for coming to speak with us this afternoon. I will now hand over to you.
Yes, oh great. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Every time when people talk about you, you know, often, I don't know about anyone else, but I think, oh my gosh, that sounds like a very impressive set of things to have done. And then I realized, oh my gosh, that's what I've done. So in any event, I want to thank you all for having me talk about the book. It's really such a privilege to talk with all of you because of your tremendous commitment through Soroptimist, and obviously also, I'm sure, through everything else you do to women's leadership and gender equality. I know how much you do in terms of work globally at the UN and really working through those multilateral institutions to ensure that the voices of women are really, you know, preeminent throughout everything that we do globally and through, you know, conversations between government and civil society, between governments, conversations with the private sector. And I so appreciate how you all connect the issues that are in the book, but also just the way that you talk about the connections between the importance of economic development, but also looking at the impact on climate change and peace and security. So to me, this is really an honor to talk with a group of women who really understand how interconnected all of these issues are and how important it is that we make progress on all of them, hopefully in a pace, because there are so many issues that we need to address and challenges we need to face. So what I thought I would do is really talk very briefly about why I wrote this book and just touch a bit on a high level, you know, sort of some high level statistics. And then I know we're going to have a conversation quite focused on the issues around conflict and women's role in peace and security, which are, you know, are issues that I've certainly worked a lot on during my career, particularly in the last bit of time at the State Department and also working for nonprofit and non-governmental organizations outside the United States. So I wrote this book really for two reasons. One, I always say it was my COVID project, which is somewhat true. As we all had more time with COVID, I started to think about something that had occurred to me or happened to me quite often as I traveled and spoken at various events, which is that people, women in particular, but men and women, talk to me or would say to me, you know, I really want to be active or take an action or have an impact on an issue, but I kind of don't know what to do. Or the issues are so overwhelming, I don't know where to start. Or I'm not sure that anything I do is going to actually have an impact. So I decided about what I had done throughout my career, you know, as an attorney, working on Capitol Hill, working as an advocate or lobbyist. I appreciated the difference. And then working with women, both in the United States and abroad, to really think about how to pull together a lot of what I had worked on and learned and put it into this book, which really helped, I think, me organize my thoughts, but also I think, as I've seen in talking to lots of different groups, provides quite a good roadmap for people and guidebook about the kinds of actions that they can take. The book, obviously, as you mentioned, deals with these four very interconnected issues. Obviously, education, political and economic participation are all connected to each other. And if we don't address the scourge of gender-based violence and other issues like it, we really are creating an additional impediment to women's full participation in society in whatever way they choose to participate. So I wanted to really focus on those four issues. And in each one of the parts of the book, provide really examples and research about why focusing on girls' education, economic empowerment, political participation, addressing gender-based violence, how those working on those issues isn't just the right thing to do. in terms of human rights and women's rights, but it also has a quite critical impact on building stronger, more sustainable, and more prosperous societies for everyone, not just for women and girls, but really across the board. So I wanted to have that research broken down by issue, and then provide people with ideas about interventions and programs and policies in each of those issue areas that have worked. Things like when you're talking about education, how to encourage families to send girls to school, whether that's conditional cash transfers or providing reduced school fees when there is sometimes a financial impediment to girls going to school. Or in the economy, really looking at how to ensure there are equal pay laws or laws that are not discriminatory around women's access to the economy, which are really quite, widespread around the world. And political participation, again, looking at things like how to encourage women to run for office, how to start that early, because of course we see that that kind of engagement and interaction starts in high school and college, and women already start to pull back. But there are ways to think about encouraging that kind of participation. So I really wanted to provide that kind of information for people. And also in the book, in each section, provide a list of resources, books, research that people could use again in their own advocacy. Because my thought really about this book is, given this, everyone has a certain lens or angle on women's equality or gender equality, and really giving people the maximum number of tools and ideas to really focus on how to push that equality, that advocacy forward. And so that's what the book really tries to do. It outlines these issues and creates really a roadmap for people to follow in the way that they would like to around advocacy for women and girls. I would just say, I think this group knows it, but it's really important to highlight that, again, this is so important, not just because we know that engaging women and girls is critical, but that, again, has an economic impact, a political impact. It impacts stability, and which is really a good segue for the way we talk about women's role in conflict resolution. We know that when peace agreements, for example, are entered into, and women have been part of that process, they're much more likely to be successful and last a longer period of time. We know that women raise not only issues of importance to women in peace talks, but we know that they raise community issues and often bring their unique perspectives to those, to those conversations, to those negotiations, and that they can really drive change in a way that's meaningful for not just themselves and their families, but for their communities writ large. And so I think what we see throughout the work that's been done to really document the importance of women's participation is that it has wide-reaching effects. And I think that's why the work that you all do and the work that so many advocacy groups do to really raise the voices of women throughout decision-making is so critical. So with that, I think I'll close this sort of overview of why I wrote the book, and love to start the conversation and answer as many questions as we have time for. So I'm excited to do that.
Thank you, Stephenie. You certainly speak our language. There's no doubt about that. And your COVID project has actually brought a lot of education, resource and research to the hands of a lot of women and girls through that book, which is great to see. I'll start with the first question. During conflict, what are the unique immediate needs of women and girls?
Well, I mean, I want to talk about that somewhat generally, but I will say we certainly know, and we have a slide that we put up, and by the way, we're willing to obviously share these with all of you, because that way you don't have to take notes. But as we see, and I think looking across the globe at what's going on in Ukraine and then what happened in Afghanistan, I just, during last summer, I think what we see is very clear that women and girls are the people who bear the brunt of conflict really across the globe. It really goes to, again, the issues around, if you see and think about the displacement that's occurring in Ukraine. According to the UN right now, there are approximately 5 million refugees who have left Ukraine, and about 7 million internally displaced people within their country. With regard to refugees, 90% of those refugees are women and children. With displaced people, it's a little more balanced on the gender front, but we really see in those kind of situations with conflict, the disproportionate impact on women sort of being upended from their lives and really, having to make incredible changes in terms of where they live and how they live. I think that's also true, and I would just put a little bit of a pin in this. It's also true in terms of displacement that occurs because of climate change. We know that climate change and disasters, that there are many, many more refugees who are women and children based in those kind of situations, climate and disaster related displacement. Again, there are issues around lack of access to resources. Obviously, as people are displaced from their homes and their jobs, access to healthcare and education, and an increase, obviously, in having to really pull together something in a very, very difficult situation. So conflict, not only drives change for everyone in a country, but is disproportionately really burdensome on women and children. We also know, and this is not something that's really pleasant to talk about, but we also see this in conflict, that there's increased gender-based violence. There have been reports recently coming out of Ukraine about the use of rape as a weapon of war, which does occur often in conflict. And there was a lot of really compelling research about that. We see that sometimes there can be an increase in trafficking. And in fact, that's also been something that has come up in terms of the displacement of women as they've moved across the border into Poland. There was a really interesting story on National Public Radio here in the US last week about there's a new organization founded by some women who are picking up essentially women at the border and taking them, to cities in Poland. And the reason these women started to do this is that they found that there were men who would sort of hang out at the border between Ukraine and Poland and offer women rides. And really they were trafficking them, or they were trying to traffic them. So we see that those issues come up. I thought the story that was on National Public Radio here was so interesting because it was such a great story of this group of women, Polish women, who just decided that was something they had to address, and really figured out a way to, have this car service, organized a lot of women to kind of go to these border refugee areas and really, talk to women and ensure that they understood that they didn't have to go with them, but that if they wanted to, they were willing to take them to other safe places in Poland. So I do think there's a disproportionate impact on women in conflict. I know we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, but it's really why the UN and really the UN and countries around the world have developed an agenda around the importance of women in the peace and security space, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which I think has been so critical to really highlighting not only the negative impact of conflict on women and girls and children, but how women can really be drivers of change.
It's certainly required now or yesterday, that action. There's no doubt about that one. Thank you. What can you tell us about the safety and security of women and girls during periods of conflict or crisis?
Well, I think that's certainly one of the tremendously overriding issues that we see, is that during conflict, crisis, whether it's war or again an environmental crisis or a disaster, those are the issues that really need to be paid attention to. And I think one thing I would say that I have seen, and I've worked, in a lot of different environments, and right now I'm actually also back at the US State Department for a very short time working on Afghanistan and the impact of relocation on women and girls, relocation to the United States, essentially, and how that's impacting women and girls. But, I think what we see is the critical importance of governments and non-governmental organizations to really focus on ensuring that women are engaged in decision-making. Again, whether that's at the national or global level, whether that is, women in parliament, women in ministries, but also women really at the local level, so that as women are, are sort of engaged in this process of having to upend their lives and figure out how to address those challenges, that people in government and NGOs that are working with them ask them what's important to them and ensure that those conversations are occurring so that decisions aren't being made about women's lives without their participation and input. We also know that a lot of times governments, I think this is true globally, are really looking to try to address an issue without having a specific gender lens. And the thing I think that's heartening in the last probably 15 to 20 years, and certainly in the last 10, is much more of a focus on the need for a gender lens on foreign policy and development assistance and crisis response, and the use of gender advisors and protection advisors who have the specific task and job to really raise those issues as there is some kind of response to humanitarian crisis or a conflict, again, so that the issues around safety and security can be addressed as quickly as possible. I mean, the last thing I would say on that is that we often address issues around safety and security after something has happened. And that's important to address them as soon as possible. But one thing I think, again, people are paying more attention to is the need for prevention and to really build into any kind of policy that we are putting into place, how we're going to prevent gender-based violence, how we're going to ensure safety. And again, those can be very simple things, like ensuring that in refugee camps or settings where there are a lot of internally displaced people, that there's good lighting, that the bathrooms are not placed in dark corners, that there are safety measures put in place so that women and children have the ability to go about their daily lives without having to worry about safety and security. In food distribution, for example, it can mean making sure that if there's a food distribution center, that the food is distributed not in 50-pound sacks of rice, but in smaller kind of packaging, so that women can take that and not be in a situation where they're having to sort of be engaged in kind of one-on-one conflict to get food that might be too heavy for them to carry, and having to depend on other people. So I think there are lots of ways we can think about addressing safety and security that are both very macro in terms of women at the peace table and women in the security sector, but also very micro at the level of lighting and food packaging, and ensuring that we're really giving women the tools they need to protect themselves.
Thank you. Well, what can be done to encourage women to step into leadership roles and to enhance the safety and security of women and girls during conflict?
Sure. I mean, I think, as you all know, because you're so you're such great advocates for women's leadership, I think it's so critical that women are engaged in policy advocacy, politics, running for office, voting, helping candidates and others develop good policy platforms. I think one of the things, and I do talk about a little bit about this in the book, and it's also why I wrote the book in large part, is it's really important that young women see participation and leadership as important. I mean, I'm heartened by the fact I think there are a tremendous number of young people and young women right now who really are passionate about making change, particularly around issues like climate change and equality. But, you know, research still shows that a lot of young women sort of pull themselves out of running for student body office or being, you know, leaders at school. So I think it's important for us to really encourage that early, to invite girls, you know, to participate at events, to really listen to them, to encourage them to really identify issues that they care about and take on leadership roles. I just have a kind of interesting story. Ooh, a couple
We
of
have music.
yeah, maybe okay. A couple of about 6 weeks ago, I did a couple of conversations like this on one day, and one of them was with a group of sort of people who are focused on global and foreign policy issues, and then another was with a group of, you know, teenagers here in Washington, D.C. And, you know, it was interesting. Obviously, these two groups cared about different issues. One was much more about foreign policy, and the other was about, you know, how they could make their schools more responsive to their needs. And I thought it was so fascinating because the young women and young men in this group of teens were talking about the importance of addressing dress code issues and making sure that they felt comfortable at school in terms of what they could wear, and that they didn't feel that they were being that, you know, the schools were really burdening them and making their lives more difficult because they were having to fight about what they could wear to school. So you realize that, you know, there are so many issues that people are interested in being advocates on. And I think it's important to really start people on that path at an early age. And then I think, as you know, as we all participate in civil society and in our communities, really encouraging other women's leadership and encouraging your friends to run for office or take on a certain role, doing it yourself. I think all of those things are critically important, because we know that, you know, in countries where there are more women in leadership, there are there are positive outcomes in terms of you know, women bringing their diverse perspectives to the table. Again, whether that means, and we see the research shows that when there are more women ministers or parliamentarians in countries, those countries tend to enter into environmental treaties at a higher rate. We see that women raise issues when they're in parliaments and in, you know, local elected bodies around spending on education and healthcare. There have been recently in the Middle East women parliamentarians who've really made great progress on reforming inheritance laws so that women can inherit property and pass on citizenship to their children. So there are so many things that women bring their life experience to the table that can be addressed. And I think it's really important to encourage that from an early age, but also throughout our lives, where we are all, I think, facing a world that's very challenging and looking for ways that we can make a difference. And I think that's really important. It can be in the corporate boardroom, in politics, in advocacy, in education. So I think there are really just so many ways to ensure that there are diverse voices and in leadership, you know, women, different ethnic groups, ages, et cetera, to really ensure that the decision makers in our countries and communities reflect who we are.
That is so, so true. Reflective in so many things that are happening around the world. What can people do within their communities to decrease the negative impact conflict has on women and girls and other marginalized populations?
You know, I think this is such an interesting question because, again, I think there's so much that we can do at a macro level. As you know, the decision makers can do. I mean, we need to ensure that our governments are including women in peace negotiations, you know, that we have women the ability for women to feel comfortable being in security forces, because we know that, often that when there are women in peacekeeping operations, that they're much more able to diffuse conflict at that, on the ground. But I think it also starts from being very mindful about how we actually, how do I say this? How we actually, encourage people, our kids, to really resolve their conflicts that they have, or that all of us to resolve conflicts that we may have, and to really dial down the idea that we should be, that it's kind of boys will be boys, and if a boy hits a boy, that's what boys do. I think all of that, while it seems kind of benign at the time, actually isn't, because it builds a culture that that's the way you resolve conflict, that you're right and someone else is wrong, and not really looking at how to bring people together in a way that finds common ground. So for me, while I think the macro things are incredibly important, because we know that the research shows that, when we have women at the peace table, these agreements are more durable. When we have women peacekeepers, they're able to diffuse conflict. We know there's research here in the US that that women police officers are more able to diffuse conflict than male police officers, in a recent study that just came out. So, we know these things make a difference. And that violence is a predictor. Violence against women can be a predictor of conflict. So looking at the connection between what happens to individual women and the bigger picture. But I also think then taking that and really trying to think about how in our daily lives we can encourage a different way of resolving conflict and bringing people together. We can encourage, our male allies and husbands and brothers and sons, when they hear denigrating talk about women, or when somebody, confronts them with a conflict, that they try to dial it down and really say that isn't the way that we should be resolving conflict. We live in a time now, I will just say, and this is not what I wrote about in the book, but I think we live in a time, at least here in the United States, where there's just so much like anger. And I think, that has a spillover effect into the greater, bigger world. And so we need to figure out a way to really, I think, mediate that anger and bring people together so that they can see the commonality that we all have. Because one of the ways that we know that happens in conflict and war and peace, and the buildup to that, is really creating this sense that the other group is the other, right? There are us and then them. And if somebody is the other, it's much more easy to feel like they aren't a person, or that group isn't equivalent to your group. And so it's okay to engage in a conflict, or to bully them, or to, take all these different actions that can really, in the long run, create much more of a violent and unstable world. So I think we need to, again, look at it from both the macro and more of the micro level.
Certainly very interesting information. Are there any conflict situations where women change the course or length of the conflict, and what best practices should be followed?
Yes, the research is very interesting. Obviously, women, as we've talked about, are really, the conflict impacts women. Conflicts impact women at a disproportionate manner. But at the same time, we know that women, that conflict is also, because it does shake up society and shake up everything about society, it can also have an impact on gender norms. And we see that in conflict sometimes, because societies are struggling, that those gender norms can shift such that women actually take on different roles than they took on before. Of course, conflict means that women are often take on much more caregiving and figuring out how to kind of keep their family together. But we see in places, some places, that really the view of what women can do expands, because in conflict it has to. I think that's been true. One of the countries that people point to most often as a kind of example of this is Rwanda.
Yes.
Where there certainly was a genocide. The country was torn apart. And as it rebuilt, there was a real focus on trying to figure out how to do that, and really a focus on how to engage women. Rwanda has the most women in parliament in the world. Its Supreme Court is at least half women. The ministers are, I think right now, probably about half women. And, it seems people are often confounded by that. I mean, there was a push by the president, Paul Kagame, to engage women, in part because I think so many men were killed in the genocide. That women were the people who were there and could really help rebuild. And so, while I don't think that's the way we should go about increasing women's leadership, you do see that conflict can change the way that gender norms are sort of structured in people's minds. We also see this through the fact that there are women combatants who are combatants not just for in militaries, but for non-state actors. One of the most interesting things is in the Colombia, the sort of civil conflicts in Colombia between the Colombian government and the FARC, which was, is depending on your view, a terrorist or revolutionary group. I go with terrorist, but about 30% of the combatants for the FARC were women, at least. It might even be more. It's just hard to really judge those things. And that you see that women, are engaged as combatants for non-state actors as well, that they often take on roles that we don't often think of as being roles for women, or certainly during the time the FARC was started. But conflict kind of upends everything, and women respond to what's going on in front of them in a way that sometimes we are surprised by.
Mm-hmm. Rwanda came to my mind too when you were starting to talk about that issue. We have some very strong Soroptimists there. What issue for women and girls in conflict situations might be surprising to most of us?
Well, I think this issue of, women as combatants, I think there is this sense that I think this is really changing. But, there has been this sense over time that women are inherently more peaceful. And in fact, what we're talking about is that, engaging women leads to more stability, which I think is a little different than saying women are innately, conflict averse and peaceful. It's the idea that, building a more cohesive society brings stability. But I do think the thing that we often don't think about is that women do participate as combatants in groups like the FARC, in groups like the Irish Republican Army, in multiple groups around the world that have, engaged in violent action. There have been women who have engaged in that violent action, probably about 10 to 15%. The studies of when you look at sort of ISIS in the most recent, in the last 10 to 20 years, when we've all been looking at ISIS and the caliphate kind of concept, they're about 10 to 15% of the people who went there from the West to engage in, terrorist activity on behalf of ISIS were women. So I think that is surprising. So I think it's something we need to, again, always understand that, women are not monolithic, that there are women, come to the world and the issues before them in a lot of different ways and with a lot of different perspectives.
Your conversation is so informative, Stephenie. Thank you. And if all of us were to take one action today, what would you recommend?
Well, I think, first of all, you all do a lot of what it's so important to do, which is continue to raise the issues of the importance of women's leadership across every part of society. Again, whether it's in the corporate sector, whether it's in the women's entrepreneurship arena, whether it's in the advocacy world, addressing peace and security issues. I think that's so important. I think in terms of really taking an action, I think one of the most important things we can all do is to every day think of, one thing we can do to support women. And it can be everything from, asking your employer or your NGO, if they're buying goods and services from women-owned businesses, or, encouraging people to do that. It's really, in terms of peace and security, I think really thinking about ways to de-escalate conflict and bring people together. I think there are so many things that can be done that we all do kind of intuitively, but I think maybe being a little bit more mindful about them and thinking about, I'm doing this because it has a positive impact on gender equality, and then a broader sense of peace and security, and maybe talking to people about why you did it. Like, why is it important to buy from women-owned businesses? Why is it important, that women run for office, or that politicians, that we go meet with a politician about economic development, or that we address issues and make sure that domestic violence hotlines are accessible to people in multiple languages, or in 24 hours a day. I think there are so many things that we do that we don't think about, but it's important, I think, to make sure we're talking about what we do, and also helping people understand why we're doing all these things and taking a lot of actions that really, in the long run, not only help the individuals, but help us build a more sustainable communities.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Stephenie. Your background and career certainly come through in your discussions. Your experiences are just ad lib all the time. It's wonderful to hear. I'd like to, first of all, just acknowledge my advocacy team that's online. And I'm not going to get them to say hello tonight because Bev can't talk for a start. But Bev Bucher, which is the chair of our Global Policy Committee. And do you want to just wave or put your hand, raise a hand, Bev? Ah, yes, there she is. Thank you. And Ulla.
Hi.
Ulla Madsen is also an advisor to advocacy as well. So they're helping me behind the scenes. So it's wonderful to see. Thank you. We might open it up to questions from the floor. And if you're happy with that, Stephenie.
Sure.
Yes, Ulla?
I have a question, yes. Thank you so much, Stephenie. I'm blown away of your knowledge, and it has been so interesting to listen to. So thank you for being here today. I have a question for you. How are we going to ensure that girls receive an education in Afghanistan? And what can we as Soroptimists do? Because, it's devastating what's going on in Afghanistan. And how can we help? In what way can we help? I went to a lecture the other day with a German organization that is working down there from 1994 in special area of Afghanistan. And they succeeded in establishing a school. But as you know, young women over 12 are not allowed to go to school. So how can we help there and educate them, because it's so important?
Yes, and it is interesting. I served at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul from 2012 through 2013, and then worked at the State Department until early 2017. And one of an issue that I have worked on a lot and am very concerned about, as are all of you. I find the situation, first of all, interesting because the Taliban, as you say, have barred secondary, well, girls over 12 from going to school, but not young women from going to university. So it's this very odd, girls can go to primary school, young women can go to university, and then there's this huge gap in the middle. There are, just on the university point, some interesting developments that I've read about. Not a lot of young women have gone back to the universities yet, because they're nervous about it, because they're not sure what it's going to be like. But there are some who have, and so that's something to follow. I think on the secondary education point, obviously it's a travesty. The Taliban, a few weeks ago, it looked as though schools were going to open, and that was at the end of March, about March 20th or so. It looked like schools were going to open. In fact, girls went to their secondary schools expecting to be able to go to school, and they were turned away. And this has been, there's been a lot of backlash, not just from, people in the West, but people in the Islamic world, Islamic religious scholars. I mean, it's been a tremendous sort of outpouring of people saying that it's so important that girls get to go to school. And again, it's from really quite a wide range of people. And I think one of the most important things is that Muslim countries and Islamic scholars have really been raising this point over and over again. So I think there's a lot of pressure right now about this issue, and keeping that pressure up is really important. So that's something we can do. I do think it's interesting, just one other kind of point. I've read a couple of things and gone to a couple of, events where, technology, again, I sort of have a love-hate relationship with it, but there are people really working to figure out how to ensure that, to the extent possible, there's online access to education for girls over 12. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of things embedded in that. You have to have a computer and access to the internet, which not everyone has. But there are a lot of, groups in Afghanistan that are working for that, towards that, really trying to embed the use of technology in the solutions to this challenge right now. But I do think keeping up the pressure is important, because this is certainly a critical issue, and it's a travesty.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Does anyone else from the floor have a question? If you raise your hands, and I have Ula looking for me as well, because we can't see everyone on the one screen.
No, there are some comments, but not questions directly. But maybe someone wants to.
I'm happy to ask one. It's many refugees from the Ukraine are now in other countries, and how can we support them to integrate into their new surroundings? I know you talked about the the women from Poland who were making sure women and girls had safe travel, but what can we do here and around the world to support them?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very interesting. I know the U.S. just launched something called United for Ukraine, and agreed to take in 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. And I know other countries are doing the same. Obviously, this is a tremendous outflow of people. And at the same time, a lot of the reporting on the news kind of reflects that many Ukrainians want to go back to Ukraine as soon as they can, that they're not seeking, to be refugees, that they want to go back and help rebuild their country. So I think that's often the case with refugees, but certainly seems to be the case with a lot of the refugees who are interviewed, have been interviewed. So, but while people are here in the US or in other places, whether it's Ukrainians or Afghans or refugees from other places, I think, trying to ensure that we're we, people who are working with them, whether it's in the government or NGOs, are really talking to them, talking to the women who are part of those communities to see what they need. You know, often it's language skills. You know, in the US, really hard to get a job if you don't speak English. And so, for example, with the Afghan refugee population, you know, there's a big push to ensure that there's access to language skills, and also thinking about ensuring that people have access to, you know, job skills, ensuring that they have access to the kind of services they need in their communities. But I do think one of the most important things in dealing with refugee populations or internally displaced populations is to make sure to really talk to those communities and the people in those communities, the women specifically, and ask them what they need. I mean, obviously there's a need for, you know, housing and safety and things like that, but there are also sometimes things that we don't think about because we aren't in those communities and we aren't refugees. So I think one of the most important things to do is to, again, talk to people, to really be supportive of efforts to engage those refugee populations in decisions that get made about their lives, however long they're going to be somewhere. You know, they may be here in the US or in Poland or in another country for a long time or a short period of time.
Thank you, Stephenie. And I might, I hate to put you on the spot, but we do have the President of Europe here, Caroline, on. You may like to add to what Stephenie's saying and an update to what you're doing, because we have Soroptimist, Stephenie, in all of those surrounding countries as well as Ukraine. So it's very interesting to hear what our Federation of Europe is doing. Caroline?
Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, well, thank you. We indeed have Soroptimists in Ukraine, and actually they had all the clubs together had a Zoom meeting on Tuesday when the invasion by Putin occurred on Wednesday. So you can imagine there are, just like us, professional women wanting to build up a better life for women and girls. So that's the status they had before they became refugees. They are mostly, we have all mapped out. So those in Ukraine that were in the war zones mainly got to the western part of Ukraine, staying in Ukraine, and went to the Polish and the Moldavian zones. The one from the south went to Moldavia. Right now, we have them all mapped out. So we are in contact with every single Soroptimist of Ukraine, and also those in Russia. The Russians are supporting us through the Red Cross, because Soroptimist Europe could be like already, well, the name Europe in it already is like subversive for Russians. We are very proud of what the Polish Union is also doing. We have on the federation level, we have the Disaster Recovery Fund, and a lot of you here have sponsored us. Thank you very much. We could sustain already huge projects, and we also have the project matching. So this is where a project is set up by a club, mainly in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and so on. And they ask for help to fulfill the project. That was like filled in like this. So we have all hands on Soroptimist working there in the refugee zones. We started with kind of, how would I say, charity things, like giving essential goods. And then we evolved to real projects. So like in a monastery that was given to Soroptimists, we could buy like washing machines so that the people who came in could, well, recover by having their clothes washed and feel better. And now we are already heading to the next step, and we are providing lessons in English and a lot of German, because they all love to go to Germany. It's like for Africa, it's the UK. For them, it's like Germany. And because they want to work. They don't want to live on charity. They really want to work. They want to contribute and not having their hands like in poverty. And what we see now is that they themselves want to stay close to the border. well, because they want to go back to Ukraine. They want to pick up what they have left there. But for their children, for the girls, they want them to be able to attend Western university, Western education. They don't want them to go back to the danger zone they came out. So we are already now at the third step, and we could never have done that if there wouldn't have been this huge Soroptimist solidarity. I never could have dreamt that this would happen, that so much Soroptimist would stand along with us. So I'm very grateful to everyone here in this audience, and please, well, forward it to everyone who has supported. Thank you, Maureen, for giving me the floor again. But we need still a lot of support, because these educational programs, this trauma experts, psychologists, and so they that's the next step, and that's also very, well, expensive, I would say. Thank you very much, Maureen, for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Carolyn, very much. Do we have any other questions from the floor? Any comments? I can't see any hands up. You know how to raise the hand under reaction button at the bottom. You click that and you'll see your hand raise. I've just been through everyone. Well, I think I can't see any more questions. I'd like to call on President Maureen to thank Stephenie, please.
Thank you, Lee. That was, Stephenie, that was just absolutely wonderful. Your experience and expertise on this subject just comes through so well. And on behalf of Soroptimist International, can I thank you for giving your time this afternoon? And may I also say thank you for your COVID-19 project. It is a fascinating book and it is so informative. I really encourage everybody to read it. I have got so many ideas for when I leave the post of Soroptimist International. I'm going to advocate and take forward many, many things. So again, thank you. I think we've all been inspired by your insight into this important topic. And as Carolyn has just said, Soroptimists throughout the world do stand in solidarity with all people for their fight for freedom to live their lives free and independent. And you have given us some ideas and tools on how we can move forward in this, because we have many issues that Soroptimists care about, and they do take action within their local communities. So may I thank you and Lauren and Angela for all the help that you've given us in putting on this seminar. It has been absolutely wonderful, and I do sincerely thank you.
Well, thank you all for having me. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate all the work you do, and so glad I got to hear about what you're all focused on around Ukraine. And I look forward, I hope our paths all cross again.
Thank you very much.
Thank
So
you, Stephenie.
and everybody can unmute and they can talk among themselves. I'm going to leave it open for 5 or 10 minutes. So that's great. So thank you.
Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you all.
And everyone knows that the where you can buy the book from Stephenie, and you may be able to use that as a guide for projects within clubs and across borders. Even though we have a lot of live projects we just heard about now from Europe. But I think it's a wonderful book and an educational resource book for each and every one of us, available at, well, Amazon. Maureen got hers, so any bookseller, I would assume.
Yes,
Yeah,
any
Noble, and yeah, anybody, yeah.
Thank you,
well,
Lauren.
I'm going to head off to work. So thank you again so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I do look forward and hope we can connect again.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Stephenie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.